Hello and welcome to Forbidden Talk, a program dedicated to exploring sensitive social issues in the Middle East. Today we shall be looking at the plight of refugees in Europe. The continent is experiencing one of the most significant influxes of migrants and refugees in its history. Pushed by civil war and terror and pulled by the promise of a better life, hundreds of thousands of people have fled the Middle East and Africa, risking their lives along the way. The scale of the crisis has put huge pressure on some destination countries, particularly Greece, Austria and Hungary. At least 350,000 migrants crossed the EU's borders in January to August 2015, compared with just 280,000 during the whole of 2014. And that 350,000 figure is an estimate from the International Organization for Migration, which doesn't include the many who crossed the border undetected. Among the forces driving people to take such risks are the conflicts raging in Syria and Afghanistan. The human rights abuses in Eritrea also contribute to this number. The majority, 62% of those, have reached Europe by boat so far this year from these countries alone. We'll be discussing these issues and more, but first I'd like to introduce my studio guests. First of all, we have with us Sajjad Hussain Shah, who has been dealing on the ground with refugees in Lesbos for various charities, Love for Humanity being the one that he is the director of at the moment. We also have with us Mariam, who is a journalist, an independent journalist, Mariam Sayed, who's joining us to also look at the international implications and the depth of the context of this problem. But before we get into the discussion with our guests, let's take a look at this brief report on Europe's refugee crisis.
Refugees and migrants are risking their lives to reach Europe. Many have fled conflict and poverty. If they make it to the borders, they are often met with violence and ill treatment. Again and again, their human rights are denied. People come to Europe for different reasons. Many are fleeing persecution or war and hoping to seek shelter as refugees in Europe. Others are migrants, leaving behind poverty and hoping for a better future for themselves and their families. Lives are being lost and human rights denied as the European Union member states invest heavily in policing borders at the expense of treating those approaching borders fairly and humanely. The EU's priority appears to be to prevent people from entering its territory at all costs, even if those people are in need of safety and protection. The European Commission allocated Greece more than 10 times the budget to keep refugees and migrants out from 2011 to 2013 than to assist their reception. No matter how high European countries build their walls, and no matter how often they shift responsibility to neighbouring countries, people will still be compelled to flee persecution, conflict and poverty by coming to the EU. Amnesty International say they want to see the EU strengthen search and rescue capacity in the Mediterranean to identify boats in distress and assess those on board, end unlawful pushbacks and collective explosions, and ensure that those rescued are treated with dignity and have access to asylum procedures where appropriate. They also want the European governments to create safe routes for refugees to Europe. Refugees must not be forced to take dangerous journeys. The European states should make a firm commitment to international solidarity by significantly increasing resettlement quotas. Amnesty urged that Europe must ensure that human rights are the foundation for any migration control cooperation with third countries. Agreements must be transparent, enshrine adequate protection standards and fully respect the rights of asylum seekers, refugees and migrants. Many Western countries really do want to welcome refugees, but not all of them. Denmark, for instance, is very hesitant, as is the UK. The former Eastern Bloc governments and their populations absolutely don't want them. They are frightened about their jobs, about the strain on their economies, and about the Muslim character of most of the refugees. So there is, in fact, a conflict going on inside the EU because of the refugee crisis, one which threatens to destabilize it further in the wake of the economic crisis of recent years.
Well, it seems to be a question of moral conscience of Europe against economic common sense on the surface, but the refugee crisis in Europe has much deeper underlying issues and a huge short and long-term implication for Europe's citizens. So let's turn to our studio guests to help unravel the very complicated issues surrounding this. Sajjad, as you've been out there in Lesbos, where the primary access point for refugees arriving in Europe seems to be at the moment, Lesbos and the islands around Greece. Well, it's certainly one of the prime ones. But you refuse to, first of all, use the terminology that seems to have become taken as commonplace, certainly within Western media. This idea of refugee, migrant, or survivor? You've raised this issue. What makes you raise that issue, first of all?
Thank you for, first of all, having me in the studio, and I would like to thank God to allowing or providing this opportunity to serve humanity, because it is, I believe, a privilege to be able to do that. Yes, the narrative, I believe, does need to be changed, because I feel that the word refugee has become almost like a dirty word for the people travelling across Europe. And I strongly feel that they should be called survivors rather than refugees or migrants, because they are surviving a death cult that is prevalent and spreading throughout the Middle East and North African countries.
So this death cult you talk about and the origins that they come from, clearly these people are traumatized in the first place, but can you give us an idea of, when you were out there, whether this trauma that they come with from conflict zones actually is alleviated a little when they're, say, for instance, in Turkey, because Izmir seems to be one of the major the starting points, certainly from the Turkish side of things. Alexandria is another one we hear of quite regularly. But let's focus on Izmir. What's the condition of these people who are coming at that stage?
To be honest, I'm very glad you've touched on that point. A lot of people who have been in contact with ourselves, volunteers and people in our respective towns and cities where the volunteers come from, have all sort of called me and called the people who have come out to volunteer and said, "Hey, you guys are our heroes." And when this was said to me, it sort of took me by surprise. And I said to the person who was talking to me about this, saying, "You know something? I'm not the hero in this. The hero is the family who traveled from Sinjar, the place where approximately 100,000 young men were murdered in cold blood. And this particular family, a family of 8 who traveled from Sinjar and survived the death cult in Sinjar in Iraq and traveled through that country, ducking and diving the bombs and bullets and this death cult, and not just one death cult, but numerous death cults which have sprung. And then traveling through Syria, and again, ducking and diving the bullets and the different various death cults that have propped up there. And then eventually coming to Turkey and entering the border, which is another hellhole and a very hellish sort of scene, which I've seen with my own eyes. And then traveling through this humongous country, through different areas where, again, they're not very welcome, being mistreated by, unfortunately, fellow Muslims as well.
What are the kind of things that they face here? Because I can imagine in the hellhole you talk about where they come from, where the death cult you've described exists, ISIS, etc. But when they come to Turkey, you'd have thought that there's a sort of a compassion. But in reality, you've raised an issue of all sorts of criminal activities. Can you tell us a little bit about those criminal activities which surround the entire refugee crisis?
Absolutely. But it is worth mentioning that these are the people who are the real heroes, who are surviving the death cult and the journey itself, and then eventually finding the apparent or the alleged safety of Europe. There is a lot of hidden stories amongst all of this, and that is, and I'd just like to touch on the surface of some of these, and I would like maybe the viewers and the parties out there to maybe look a bit deeper and search for the evidence, because it is out there. And that is the trafficking of the survivors, and you will hear me say survivors a lot, and that's trafficking of young females who have lost their men in the respective countries where they've come from, and they're now traveling alone through Europe, who unfortunately get picked up by gangsters and criminals throughout Europe. Mm-hmm. Then something even more tragic than that is the trafficking of very young children who are either abandoned or orphaned. And then even more tragic than that, and it does get worse, I'm sorry to say this to the viewers who may be listening, because some of what I've experienced over 8 weeks myself. And it does get quite emotional and quite harrowing as I talk about it and the people who listen to this. And that is the trafficking of very young children. And then on top of that, these very young children who either die throughout the journey, or something more sinister happens to them and their bodily organs are trafficked. It almost seems that there seems to be this growing...
So yeah, this is really important, and I can see this range of issues you've raped, and you talked about rape. You've talked about the issues of child abuse. You're beginning to talk about prostitution and all sorts of issues, which I want to go into in more depth further as we go along. But we have joining us on the line actually somebody who was in Lesbos at the same time as you were as well.
Okay.
It's I believe we have Saifur Rahman with us online.
Yes. Hello.
Saif, can you describe your journey? The initial startup of your journey began in Afghanistan. Why did you leave Afghanistan? What was the circumstance? Because quite often people who arrive in Europe are being accused of being economic migrants or being people who are just coming here for reasons other than the desperation. Could you tell us a little bit about your journey, particularly in Afghanistan? What forced you to leave?
I'm Saifur Rahman Ahmadzai, but now I'm coming for Afghanistan back for Pakistan. But Afghanistan now is young boys and family is very big coming for here, the Europe for the. But now I'm look inside the way for the Afghanistan now for Pakistan, the Pakistan for now inside for the Iran. But any people is I'm looking for the way Iran is a very big for not go the Iran Pakistani go for the Iran, but the way I'm looking but very children, girls and women is a big problem for the way for the car. For the army, Iranian army.
So you're saying that the Iranian police and army gave you trouble, but what I want to know is you left Afghanistan, according to your own testimony, you left because you were being hunted by people who found out that you were working for certain groups within the Afghan government. Is that why you left? You know, what I want to get to is what made you leave Afghanistan?
Hello?
Hello? Can you hear us? We've lost you slightly there, I think. Can you
Hello?
Saif, can you hear us?
Hello?
Hello, we seem to have a trouble on the line.
Yeah.
Can you hear us?
Yeah. Hello?
Okay, yeah. Could you just give me an account of why you had to leave? Because the Taliban are a well-known force in Afghanistan. And I'm trying to get to the bottom of why you left. Did you leave because there was violence against you?
First, now Afghanistan, I'm working for security supervisor. Now, but I'm 3 here inside the Black Horse camps, this army camp. Now I'm here, 3 here, I'm here work, but I'm security supervisor. Now I'm 2 here and 6 months to work, but the 2 months, 2 year and 6 months is my work is finished. But here very big, my living is very big danger. But now one day I'm go to my home. But night it's like 8 coming for another guy for the motorcycle, maybe 30, 40 guys. Is young boy, the weapon is a big weapon, pika and weapon pistol. But I'm inside my home, but outside my uncle is go for outside. Who talk me what problem? Who talk me here 2 people is for the inside for the camp army camps job. My uncle talk now. He's not my brother, not my brother's son. Maybe we're going for Pakistan now. But to talk me, what my uncle talk, what problem? They say 2 people talk, but you talk Saif. It's name, what first name Saifur Rahman, the second name Shamsul Rahman. 2 people working inside the camp. I'm not allowed these people. 2 people is going forward inside the camps to work.
Okay, so I get the picture that you're basically you were in a situation where your life was in danger, and then you made this journey, and I'll come on to the journey in a little bit more detail. When you arrived in Turkey and you had to cross the borders into Europe, what was your experience at the Lesbos camp?
First, I'm coming for Pakistan, but Pakistan is coming for the Iran.
I've got that side of the. I'm focusing on your entry point into Europe. What happened at that stage?
Sorry?
When you were in Turkey, could you tell me a little bit about when you left Turkey, Izmir? You were in Izmir. Tell me the story of what happened to you in Izmir.
Yeah, first I'm going to finish the Iran. I'm going inside the Turkey, Istanbul. But now I'm 5 days is waiting for the Istanbul, 6 days. But 6 days finished. But I'm taking one people and $1,111. But now I'm 72 people. Is very big. People is very big family and maybe 15, 16 young boy, maybe 5, 6 men and women, children is very big. Maybe all is 72 people. Go. I'm night clock 9, but inside sitting there for the bus, Daewoo bus, but go for the Izmir.
Okay,
Izmir,
so it's sounding to me like you were put on a boat and in very dangerous circumstances, and then you arrived in Lesbos. I'll take that story up with you straight after this. Seth, stay on the line, please. Don't go away. And we're going to just get a little opinion from Mariam, and then I'm going to come back to you in just a second. Mariam, you started hearing this, the human story, the social context. And we've heard a little bit of Seth's story. He's clearly a man who's now made it to Germany, and he's in Munster. He's gone on this very, very traumatic journey, which we're going to hear a little bit more about. But give us a little more context, because we're not living in a bubble with these refugees or these people traveling. We're living in a global situation in which the world powers are involved. And if you could give us a little bit of context as a journalist, what's your independent reading of the situation, and why is this whole situation come about? Why have we got such a mess?
Well, I think we mustn't forget General Wellesley Clark when he said in 2007 that in 2001 he saw the he saw the plans that were laid out under Bush's administration to take out 7 countries, yeah, and within that were within 5 years, yeah, and so those countries you're talking about Sudan, Somalia, Libya, Iraq, Syria, and Iran, yeah? And this is all part of the bigger plan. They want to carry out,
carrying out more, I guess, implementation of perhaps global resource acquisition?
Well, the thing is that they want. Did you know that in Syria already they have they've already made plans by Genie Energy, which is a Israeli company with Rothschilds as one of the shareholders and Rupert Murdoch, and already they've been consigned in Syria where they've discovered huge amounts of oil and gas. They've already got shares there, so which means there is a bigger agenda. Yeah, which is acquisition of oil, which is acquisition of gas, which is ethnic cleansing to some extent.
So, Shivana, thank you. That gives us a little bit of context, and we've got the story of Seth. I'm going to bring Seth back, but first, let's go with Shad. Shad, you see this wider context. You hear about the individual stories, and you met Seth when he was out there. Can you tell me how much hardship and how much trauma these people have to go through in the journey crossing from, say, Afghanistan, Iraq, or Syria, and then heading to these islands? And of course, that's just the beginning of the journey, because they've got to go on into the Balkans or travel to Germany. Can you tell us a little bit about that journey and what you've seen and what the problems are that you were beginning to refer to before?
Absolutely. Okay, if I just carry on where I left off in regards to the family who travelled from Sinjar and survived the death cult from Iraq, all the way through Iraq itself, which is a huge country, and then through Syria, which, as you know, multiple organizations and countries, many of whom are European, are bombing the hell out of that place, which is another story in its own right, a tragic story. And then the traveling through the border itself, which is another crazy sort of environment that they have to travel through, and eventually find the people in Turkey who are going to smuggle them across to Europe. Throughout this journey, bear in mind that we've got young men, women, elderly, special needs, pregnant women, And this has been repeated time and time again in the media, and it's become very well known that no mother puts her child in the sea if the land is safer. And that this is so true. The land is not safe. The sea appears to be very safe for these people, but unfortunately over 8,000 men, women and children have tragically drowned in the Aegean Sea. And to this day, this figure has been floating about but to be honest, if we really think about the numbers which are traveling across the treacherous, which we call the Sea of Death, I feel that there are much more dead bodies lying at the bottom of the seabed, which only get discovered as they get washed up on the beaches of either Turkey or the European coasts, especially Sycamore Scala.
Okay.
So just going on from that, this is the scene that we have, my organization, who was a team leader and a project manager of, and the volunteers have seen on the ground. A boat arrives, and there are approximately between 60 to 70 people on a boat that should only have about 15 people. The person who's actually navigating the boat is not an experienced, qualified person. It's actually a refugee and a survivor, if you like. And these people are put onto these boats at gunpoint sometimes and told,
But the question arises, where are the Coast Guards? Where are the people who are meant to be looking after the security and the safety? Where are the aid organizations? I want to come on to this, about the reception that these people are receiving when they arrive on the borders of Europe.
Okay. I think, Mohsen, I was going to say that I remember you saying that when they arrived, they were shot at, from what you were saying.
Oh yes, there were many.
They were shot at, they were kicked, and they were, what do you call, bombarded, you know, as the boats were arriving, yeah? So there was no reception whatsoever for those people.
There is no reception, and unfortunately, believe it or not, and a lot of this information is hidden from the majority of the world's public, and that is the organized smuggling that goes on between the various countries. Because unfortunately, it's the monetary value that is more important to, unfortunately, humans. And again, once again, this unprecedented human crisis has brought the best and the worst out of humanity. For example, these survivors are being charged between 1,000 to 2,500 euros per person. And it doesn't matter whether you're a child or an adult or a blind person or a special needs person, they're charging you this kind of money. They're putting them onto these boats, and many of these women are 9 months pregnant, 8 months pregnant, and the trauma of the journey, of the treacherous sea journey itself, I myself have experienced this. They go into labor, they'll give birth literally in the boat during the journey or on the beach itself. Either the mother survives or the child survives, or both of them unfortunately tragically pass away. The father goes into shock and is so shocked that he collapses. The children who are with this family...
So real trauma. I mean, I'm going to come back to you with more examples of this, because I know it sounds like you've had a chapter and verse of experience of what's going on there. But I want to bring back Saifur Rahman. Saif, are you still with us?
Yeah.
Yeah. Saif, you've heard what Sajjad Shah has pointed out in terms of the trauma and the problems that people face. Can you remember when you were put onto these dinghies, was there any violence? Were you forced onto these dinghies?
Sorry?
The boats. Were you forced onto the boats yourself?
Yeah, I'm inside boats. The boat is small, 9-meter boat, maybe 72, 74 people inside the boat. But now I'm inside maybe 72 people. But now I'm inside 3 hours and 45 minutes. I'm inside the water.
So almost 4 hours in a boat, which was meant for 15 people.
4 hours, yeah.
How did you feel?
Yeah.
How did you feel?
Yeah, but now I'm inside the boat, but 4 hours inside the water. But I'm leaving for the Yunnan. But I'm looking here any other people's UNICEF and another company. But one people's name is Sajjad.
Well, Saif, the question I'm asking is, how did the people feel? The people, what was the feeling when you were kind of on that boat? How were they?
How much people is inside?
No, how were they feeling? How were they feeling? What was the emotion? Anyway, I think we've.
Okay.
I think. Sorry, we're not fully conveying what we want to you, but I get the picture. Seth, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for your account. But it clearly verifies, Sajjad, a lot of what you're saying. That
if I can just maybe add to Saif what he's trying to explain. I think we must appreciate that he's been through a very traumatic journey. And this is a young man who can speak, I believe, up to 6 languages fluently. And English is not his best. But believe it or not, with his help for about approximately a week, our doctors and medics cannot thank Saif enough for the translation that he did for many of the survivors who needed medical care.
Well, this is what I want to come to, Sajjad. What are the larger organizations like UNHCR, or for instance, you know, the standard organizations, relief agencies you expect to be there? What's their role? What are they doing there?
Well, not much, unfortunately, but before I come on to that, it's worth mentioning that a young couple who just come off the boat, a grown man who is just sat in our car, who we're taking to the refugee camp, breaks down in my hands and cries continuously. And then the mother, and then the daughter, and then the son as well. And I said to them, after they've done their, you know, let out this emotion, that what is it that made you cry? And it's a pattern throughout all the refugees, all the survivors, who tell us the harrowing story of the death cult going door to door, pillaging and raping their men, women and children, including males as well, who have been raped by some of these death cult people. And then the harrowing story of being lost in the sea for 5 hours in pitch dark, and saying they've survived all of this, but now they're almost close to what they see as their freedom, and now they're lost in the Aegean Sea for 5 hours, but they managed to survive that as well.
Yeah, but let's get to these agencies.
So we get
that picture. What are these agencies that are meant to be helping people doing in those initial areas? One second, Siobhan.
Unfortunately, not a great deal, and this is something that really frustrates me and gets me really angry. The reason being is these organizations, they have multi-million pound infrastructures, a huge amount of resources, but tragically it's the grassroots volunteers who are arriving on these islands and helping. There seems to be a completely disassociation from the humanitarian crisis. It's almost as if it doesn't exist and they're in some parallel world, but they're there. For example, I've had many of these big NGOs, Save the Children and UNHCR even. I need to be careful with UNHCR because they've been of some help to us in facilitating our organization's ability to help and maximize our help there. However, it's worth mentioning that UNHCR could do a lot more in some of the areas which are being neglected, unfortunately. In regards to organizations like Human Appeal, Islamic Relief, UNICEF, Red Cross, Red Crescent, some very large organizations, they seem to be almost falling into the bracket of humanitarian tourists. Which really get up my nose because they don't help, they actually get in the way of the people who want to help.
Because we did ask a number of these organizations to come on the program, but sadly we've not had the reciprocation, and even I think UNHCR were due on the program and actually committed themselves to join us on the show. Unfortunately they pulled out at the last minute, which you know, sadly they're not here to give their version, but I'm sure that they'll say perhaps that we're not being given the remit by our superiors, and the EU, the EC, the UN, that these guys aren't really getting their act together in terms of whether they want these refugees coming to Europe at all. Quite clearly they don't. And Siobhan, I'm going to come to you on. I'm going to come to Siobhan on this. Why would perhaps there not be the open-armed welcome for people who clearly come from a conflict zone?
Well, the thing is that when you look at why did those people leave? Yeah, why did they leave Syria? You've got how many countries bombing Syria, and then you've got ISIS there, yeah? ISIS has been raping, pillaging, killing people, and those people frightened have left. And the thing is, who is ISIS? ISIS, when you really look at it, Edward Snowden said that ISIS was a collaboration between the, Americans and the British and Mossad, and they created an organization which basically is like a hornet's nest yeah, that attracts every form of jihadis and mercenary
okay,
and
Shweta,
whatever.
so we get into this murky world now where there's claim and counterclaim.
Yeah.
Because there's one side of the fence which...
The claim is this, that the fact that why you have bombed that places, you have bombed Libya, you have bombed Iraq. There's no place safe from this group ISIS, which has killed more Muslims than it's killed Christians or anybody else, yeah? And so at the end of the day...
So is that the root of the problem?
Well, you tell me. Apparently now, recently, they were going to go in because now Madaya is starving, and and the Syrian forces are starving the Madaya people, and so now we have to send in aid, yeah? And whereas they found out that this is not true. This is a lie, and this has been perpetuated by the various media.
It does bring another question, though. Of course, the EU and the nations in the West are actually petrified about this this wave of
They cannot be
immigrants.
petrified. They created it.
But I'm coming to the point of how people feel here. And in terms of the EU itself, do you think that their position is compromised, or is there sufficient action going on in saving these people, or dealing with the roots of the problem?
Well, from what Mr. Sajjad has been telling us, and from what I heard from the survivors, and I think it's a good term to say survivors, because these people are surviving the attacks, by the West to destroy their countries, and this is why they're here. Okay. And so sorry.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, it is clearly beginning to show the connection between the humanitarian, the social, and the cultural and the psychological impact on the individuals. But actually, when we look at the source of it, it seems as though the flow that's coming, Sajjad, is almost unstoppable. But I mean, what would you say in terms of if you wanted to see action? What actions would you want to see from those agencies?
Well, look, this journey itself and my witnessing of the many human rights abuses throughout this journey of 8 weeks has been unbelievable. To see a 2-kilometer queue of men, women and children eating, sleeping in their own feces, being abused by authorities, it's a calamity, it's a tragedy, it's a failure of the European nations who claim to be the human rights flagship of the world, which is absolutely the opposite of what's actually happening in some of these European countries throughout the journey of the refugees. And unfortunately, when these refugees arrive in the country of Macedonia, I'm getting reports that the trauma and the suffering increases tenfold because of the way they're treated in Macedonia. Thank
you, Sajjad. I've got somebody on the line with us from Amnesty International. We have an intervention in which we're going to actually question some of these large organizations and what they're doing. Sure. So I'm going to turn to our guests now before returning to the studio. In the studio, we've got us joining Iverna McGowan, who is actually heading the European institutions issues around the refugees for Amnesty International. Welcome to the show, Iverna.
Thank you for having me.
Amnesty International obviously has an international remit to look at the refugee crisis across the world from root cause to actual symptoms. All of the emphasis in the media seems to be about the symptoms, which is the refugees arriving in Europe. But let's begin with what you think Western governments can do, and perhaps governments around the world can do, to stop this flow of refugees.
So that is indeed a very valid point. As a global human rights organization, Amnesty International is looking at the conflict itself in Syria and the human rights violations around that. We have documented war crimes by the Syrian regime. We're also concerned that now, for instance, the Russian fighters just before Christmas, we're worried that some of their bombings, due to the number of death toll of civilians, could also amount to war crimes. So there's clearly a broader picture there. We would call on other countries, the international community, to call for justice and accountability in Syria and to implement the existing UN resolutions that are there and of course to take a stronger stance by referring the Assad regime to the International Criminal Court. So there's some of the measures when we look at the conflict in Syria itself that we would really like to draw international attention to.
Well, of course, with this, I mean, Amnesty will be aware of our previous kind of engagements in conflict zones, and it's a hugely complicated situation, one which Western governments are, deeply involved in, with all the kind of the airstrikes and the complications around resources. And many people say that actually the war is not necessarily just about the Syrian regime, but it's actually to do with the resources, the oil resources, the gas resources which are out there. Is there any way that you can really deal with such a situation beyond the politicians themselves getting together and getting to the real root causes of the problem?
Well, of course, it's very important to have a robust peace process, but that has to be based on taking into account justice and accountability. It's clear that any conflict involves a series of complicated geopolitical factors as well. But one point, maybe just to feed into again how some of the countries claiming to wanting to resolve the crisis have inadvertently fed into it, is why don't we look at the arms that are being used. For example, Amnesty International has released a report looking at the arms being used by the group that calls itself Islamic State in Iraq and in parts of Syria. And what's striking about that report is that we see that the guns and ammunition that group and other groups are using were actually previously transferred to the Iraqi government in other conflicts. And it's the non-implementation of international law and the Arms Trade Treaty that has led to an irresponsible proliferation of ammunition and guns in that region as well. So there's a number of complicated factors, all of which are well documented under, the framework is there under international law. Had it only been implemented, we really could have averted the scale of this crisis.
So I mean, we touched on a lot of the root causes out there. On the ground, you've got islands like Lesbos, you've got islands like there's so many Greek islands which are becoming the conduits for the immigrants initially arriving, or the refugees initially arriving. What's the state of play in terms of the rights of individuals in that zone? Because that's the stepping stone into Europe, isn't it? What's going on there?
So it's a deeply concerning situation that we're seeing. Amnesty International has documented a raft of human rights violations along the European borders. The reason for these violations, in Amnesty International's view, is that the EU and its leaders are continuing a failed strategy on migration and refugee rights. So what they're doing is constantly denying the fact people are coming, trying to erect more and more barricades to those people arriving, when actually what's needed is a real acknowledgement of the issue and a human rights-based response in terms of safe and legal routes for those in desperate need of protection. Remember, the majority of people coming are refugees that have right under international law, a right to asylum and to protection. This is, of course, a global crisis, so we're not only calling on Europe, but other countries also to play a role. It's also, I think, a critical factor. It's easy to believe a lot of the hype out there. They said about 1 million people arrived in 2015, but let's remind ourselves that the European Union population is over 800 million people. So let's put that in context. That's 1/800 millionth, if you like, of the total population of Europe that arrived. So the numbers are not as overwhelming as some politicians would have you believe. It's totally manageable. It's just the political will that's lacking to implement it.
I mean, of course, this hysteria, which is whipped up, obviously, by mainstream media in terms of immigrants, in terms of refugees, that in itself is a hugely loaded issue. The word migrant and the word refugee or the word survivor have very, very different connotations. But the Western media certainly has gone for the word migrant as its key projection of these influxes. What is that going to do to the mood in terms of the race relations, the intercommunity relations here, in terms of just the Western European attitude towards these people from conflict zones?
Well, it's quite a dangerous game, but what does give me and definitely our colleagues here at Amnesty International a sign of hope is looking at the people on the ground in Europe. Hundreds of people have extended a hand of humanity, have come out on the streets, offered their homes and goods, which has a humanizing effect. Whether we're talking about migrants or refugees, these are human beings. And I can tell from personal experience that once you've actually heard those human stories and have an idea of the horrors from which they're fleeing, then that really counters that. But politicians should equally be championing this. They should be championing it not only from the perspective of showing leadership, but also from the perspective of maintaining international law and the tenets that basically were written in history to prevent tragedies like this happening again.
Moving on to maybe some solutions, you've, Amnesty, presented 3 or 4 major points to the EC, or the European Commission. Can you tell us a little bit about those and what it is that's happened? Have you had any success in terms of the strategies that you talked about, in terms of the failures of some of those strategies from the European nations?
Of course. So if I look back to the beginning of this time last year, 2015, things were looking very dark in the Mediterranean Sea. We had thousands of people who died in the first few months of 2015 alone due to the withdrawal of search and rescue operations in the Mediterranean Sea. Now, Amnesty International campaigned with a lot of our partners to ensure that naval operations by member states were restored. And thankfully, on the contrary, now thousands of people, over 100,000 people, were saved in the course of 2015, which is huge. However, people are still continuing to die, and the reason for this is when we look and take it back at the broader picture. Why are people being forced to take such dangerous routes to safety in the first place? And there we would point to a lack of proactive resettlement places being offered, an inertia and lack of political will to implement some of the European Commission proposals on relocating people, so that to say once they do arrive that they have a prospect of being moved within Europe to a safe place. And again, the ongoing narrative of the EU and its leaders about people keeping people out, about pushing people back, rather than having a factual reflection on the matter, that what's needed is proper processing of those who arrive and safe and legal routes. Because as I said before, the numbers in reality, when you look at it, they're not overwhelming. They're perfectly manageable if a mature, fact-based policy approach was adopted.
And just finally, probably a thorny issue, but there have been obviously these huge allegations that many of these refugees, or a number of these refugees, might even be people who are coming from ISIS, and the very cause of a lot of that conflict in many people's minds. How much truth is there in that? Is there any evidence to suggest that this is happening?
So again, if we just look at the facts, a number of those people involved in the Paris attacks, as we know, were actually nationals of European countries. That's one point. But back to a broader point, there's actually convergence of interest with regard to security and protection needs. What do I mean by that? The fact that there's not adequate capacity at the borders at the moment to process the claims of people arriving, it not only means that vulnerabilities, for example, women's rights, those fleeing rape or who have special protection needs, that's not being captured. It also means that the security checks are not happening. Equally, if you look at resettlement, so a way by which people are actually airlifted from where they are into the receiving country, that process actually involves a robust security check as well. So from Amnesty International's perspective, actually the human rights compliant manner also matches some of the interests of the security concerns that are arising around this issue. And it's clear that no matter what way we look at it, that there is an urgent solution needed, because it was quite a chaotic scene in 2015.
Ivana, finally, if you had to give advice and say what should be done in a nutshell, what would your priorities be at this stage for the refugees?
So the priorities would be, first of all, the essential safe and legal routes. So we mean more humanitarian visas being issued, resettlement places, so taking people off the boats into the sky, if you like, giving them that safe access into Europe and other countries globally. We have to look at a more liberal approach to the Dublin regulation. That's an EU regulation that says that the first country of entry is the country responsible. So that's going to be reviewed this year. We'd like to see a more liberal approach to family reunification, for example, which would allow people to move to where they have more natural family ties. And we would also, of course, like to see that in its totality going forward, that international law is respected, and in particular vulnerability needs such as women and children, as per international law, are respected in this process, which is sadly currently not the case.
Ivana, thank you very much for joining us. That was a very interesting and very, very detailed account of what should happen and what is happening. We wait to see if the situation improves somewhat. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm going to come back to the studio now, and I think your opinion on this idea of people in the West beginning to become more right-wing as a result of this refugee crisis. Do you think this is a major problem that will result as a result of what's going on?
It is without a doubt, and unfortunately what I'm about to tell you is another extremely harrowing thing that was witnessed by many in Greece itself. And that was the burning of refugee survivors, where neo-Nazis had come in their droves to protest against the survivors coming to their country, which is, we all know, the pressures that they're under. But to have this happen on in Europe, and the media not to cover it is absolutely criminal.
Why was this not covered? Do you have evidence for this incident?
This happened in Greece. The evidence is there for those who wish to find it. If those people who wish to find it, they can contact the relevant parties who may have this information. You said they were burnt on the stake? They was killed and burnt on the stake alive. On top of that, tragically, there were 114 bodies in the morgue in Greece, where the local authorities said that you either bury them in 1 or 2 holes or they'll find alternative methods on getting rid of them. I would like to thank the mayor of Lesbos, who kindly, eventually, through protests that were happening around the world, provided 5,000 square meters of land to allow us to bury the dead.
But let me bring you back, Sajjad. What did you find with these frozen bodies? You talked about something very, very horrific.
The frozen bodies, as we all know, when bodies are put in the morgue, they're normally cooled down, so you can actually see the figure of the body, or you can actually recognize the person who's passed away. So these bodies were almost frozen like cube-like. And this is another thing that our volunteers were traumatized by, that the actual thawing of these bodies and then actually implementing the Islamic washing of the body and then shrouding the body was so horrific that a lot of us were traumatized.
Why was it horrific?
It was horrific because when you see a naked body that's in the state that it's in, and you know, you have the emotional connection.
But the organs is what I'm interested in.
Well,
this is
the other horrible thing that's happened, that some of the bodies of these dead have had their organs, unfortunately, and disgustingly removed from their bodies, which is another thing that Human Rights and Amnesty International really need to look into.
So organ transactions, business.
It's very prevalent. There's no point beating about the bush around this. Organ trafficking is huge out there. And this crisis, unfortunately, people have taken advantage of that. As with children trafficking, with the huge paedophile rings, unfortunately, we all know how powerful, unfortunately, some of these paedophile rings are, because it's the so-called hierarchy of society that is unfortunately and tragically involved.
The British government had 40 MPs under investigation for paedophile crimes, right? And they're still investigating. I don't know what the outcome is, but many more are under investigation, and so it's a big racket going on.
Let's stick to the organs. What's really worrying? Can you elaborate a little bit on this whole business of an underground trade in organ trafficking?
Well, to be honest, you say underground. I don't think it's underground at all. It's very open. It seems that the rich and famous seem to have now a shelving system for buying the organs that they wish to pick and choose. And unfortunately, it's the crisis that's being utilized for that.
So these criminal gangs, clearly these people who are human trafficking, there seems to be no legal or action. What are the police doing in Turkey? What are the police doing in Greece? I mean, is there no operation going on to investigate this kind of thing?
To be honest, the influx, the numbers that are arriving are so overwhelming. For example, 40 boats per night arrive on the island of Lesbos, and you're looking at between up to 70 people per boat. That's almost 3,000 people that are arriving daily in Moria camp, which has approximately 10 to 11,000 people at any one time on it. And if you look at the numbers, you cannot appreciate unless you are there. When you're looking at people, a complete diverse nationalities from all over the world, and people coming from Morocco. I mean, I don't know what on earth the Moroccan people are doing. That's 10,000 of them. Then you've got people as far as Dominican Republic, Somalia. I mean, Dominican Republic, that's right across the ocean.
So it's a But let's focus again on one of your volunteers cracked a prostitution ring. Tell us a little bit about how that works there.
Well, it's not one of our volunteers. It's a volunteer of an organisation who one of our volunteers worked closely with. And he made a not so wise decision. But however, from that decision, we found information, detailed information. He unfortunately sent his girlfriend into this brothel in Munich. Absolutely crazy thing to do. I would never condone that for any of our volunteers to take any of that kind of action. His girlfriend survived the brothel and came out with some harrowing information where these women were being charged €5 to be prostituted, to be used. And it's, to be honest, it's no surprise, but it was the fear that I personally had, that when all of these women, young women who have got no men, no protection, they're traveling alone during the night, and even in some on the islands, there was being unfortunately sexually molested or raped as well. A lot of that was happening. What are the authorities doing? That's a very good question. Again, the authorities are so overwhelmed. I mean, how do you control 40 boats that are arriving on in a detention center where you've got a small group of riot police and army?
So you've painted a really harrowing picture. Shabana, what your reaction to this? I mean, on the one hand, we've got this picture of this criminal underworld taking advantage of this situation, making money out of these refugees in all sorts of horrific ways. And you see the absence of authority, perhaps, or the sheer weight of the problem being overwhelming those authorities. But over here, I'm going to turn my attention to Europe. Most of this is not understood or heard of. We don't hear about this in mainstream media. And the overwhelming narrative that exists in the West is that these immigrants are ISIS fighters. They're people who are going to bring blowback from Syria into Europe. They're going to come and take social security or whatever other welfare state benefit systems there are in Europe. They're going to overwhelm our economy. These are all the fears that are tapping into mainstream Europe. What do you see as the implication if that kind of fear is allowed to perpetuate and if this influx continues? What do you see in your crystal ball?
It's one of the most disastrous crises that's taking place, and for humanity. Because first of all, we've got years of Islamophobia, perpetuated through the mainstream media against Muslims, terrorists, they're terrorists linked to terrorism, they're terrorists,
Okay. This is very interesting. That your feeling is that it could turn into a clash of communities if the ethnic minority communities are under pressure.
I think to some extent this is a plan, right? That they want to. I remember reading Jonathan Cook and saying that Israel's manufacturing a clash of civilizations. Yeah, and there is bound to be a clash because first of all, you've got thousands, millions heading this way. They are forced to head this way. Not that, and the media is feeding out that the fact that these people are coming, economic migrants, they're coming here because the West is good. No, they've been bombed out of their houses.
But what I'm more interested in is how do you think Middle Europe and Middle England will?
It will lead to conflict. It is going to lead to further conflict because first of all, you've got Middle England believing that Muslims are terrorists and associated with terrorism. They don't see them as survivors. In fact, if you look at some of, I heard that in Vancouver, there's some families arrived there, and they pepper sprayed them. When they arrived there, and when you see the comments underneath on Twitter saying, "Oh, great, good, they deserve it," people have no sympathy. But then there are the others who do have, but the vast majority don't have.
Well, on that
led by the lies in the media.
I think we're going to round it up there. Sajjad, your final plea as somebody who's still working out there. What would you want Europe to view these refugees as? What do you want the European governments to do? What do you want these large agencies to do?
Well, I would like to send this message out to the people who are able to do something, and I believe they can, but unfortunately don't choose to. That a small grassroots organization like ours, Love for Humanity and Mercy Worldwide, and people like IMU from Sweden and a lot of these organizations who have collectively worked with us. And I thank a lot of the Scandinavian NGOs and grassroots people who joined forces with ourselves to facilitate something very simple, but allowed us to put the smile on refugees' faces, to give them some level of comfort throughout the journey. And if an organization like ours can provide food, water, clothes, medical care, and make plans to reduce the carbon footprint of the refugees leaving behind, i.e. all the plastic and all the rubbish and stuff like that, which is destroying and damaging the island. If a grassroots level organization like ours can do that, I would like to appeal to the bigger organizations and governments around the world who burn food and destroy a lot of crops in order to keep our economies and world's economies balanced. I would like to appeal out to them that even if you was to give 1% of the food and products that you destroy, you would help immensely. And send down, instead of these people arriving in boats which are very susceptible to capsizing, and many of them, in fact majority of them die when they capsize, is to send actually armies of boats or even ferries to bring them over to Europe, because they are fleeing war-torn areas. And we can provide that. European countries can provide military ships and ferries that would stop this death that's happening.
Sajjad, thank you very much for that account. Well, that's all we have time for today. It's been an extremely interesting discussion. And it's clear that the debate about whether we look at the immigrants arriving en masse into Europe as survivors, refugees, or migrants will rage on. What is clear is that there is a criminal underworld which is exploiting those individuals with prostitution, organ trafficking, rape, and extortion. All too often, it's something which is leading to misery, which they've already suffered enough of in the conflict zones they've come from. Even in the case of economic migrants, Europe has to ask the question of whether our resource acquisition and economic security agendas are not a major root cause of the current migrations. The big question is whether European leaders will deal with the root causes or whether they will simply deal with the symptoms, which in this instance are people desperate to land on the shores of Europe. I'd like to thank my guests today, both Sajjad Shah, who's joined us kindly on the discussion, and also Mariam, thank you very much for joining us. Also, our other guests, I'd like to thank them. And just to add, you can subscribe to Levant TV's Forbidden Talk on YouTube channels as well. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. Until next time, goodbye.